This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier.
Do you still think that climate change is a hoax?
Look, I think something's happening, something's changing, and it'll change back again. I don't think it's a hoax. I think there's probably a difference, but I don't know that it's man-made.
President Donald Trump says he'll look into a recent UN climate change report that predicted we have 12 years to drastically lower our carbon footprint, or else the world will witness catastrophic impacts of climate change.
I was thinking, what if he said, no, I've seen the hurricane situations, I've changed my mind. There really is climate change. And I thought, wow, what an impact. What an impact that would make.
I'm not denying climate change, but it could very well go back. You know, we're talking about over millions of years. They say that we had hurricanes that were far worse than what we just had with Michael.
Who says that? They say. I mean, the
people
on the phone?
People say that in the...
Yeah, but what about the scientists who say it's worse than ever?
He did this as his Environmental Protection Agency is actively scaling back Obama-era regulations that would have cut back on America's carbon pollution. A lot of that work has been done in concert with lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry, including some who now work at the EPA. We know this in part thanks to the work of Eric Lipton, an investigative reporter for the New York Times. He's done a lot of reporting on the EPA, including lots of work on the ties between polluting industries and top agency officials. I caught up with Eric at the Society of Environmental Journalists annual conference in Flint, Michigan. Here's that interview. So there are over 70 environmental regulations this administration has begun or attempted to begin rolling back. Can you talk about what you've seen and why you think the Trump administration has been so aggressive in this area?
I think that when Trump was elected, it was clear from the start that one of the primary things that they wanted to do, in addition to filling vacant seats in the federal judiciary, was to eliminate as many of the Obama-era regulations across the spectrum of government.
We have begun a historic program to reduce the regulations that are crushing our economy, crushing.
And the EPA and the Department of Interior are two of the agencies where they have moved perhaps the most aggressively and expeditiously to try to undo the Obama legacy. And I think in part that's because Obama was so aggressive himself in terms of using executive powers to expand the federal government's reach at the EPA and Interior. So there's a lot of targets that Trump was able to go after.
So I want to talk about a couple of these rollbacks. One of them is chlorpyrifos. This is an insecticide that the Trump administration tried to keep on the market. Can you explain what chlorpyrifos is and what happened with the rule on chlorpyrifos?
Sure. I mean, there's been quite a number of years of medical research looking at chlorpyrifos, which is used in all kinds of vegetables and fruits in places around the United States. And there had been research that has suggested that there's a correlation between the use of chlorpyrifos and developmental disabilities, lower IQ levels, and other health issues, particularly among the children of farm workers, because this is a pesticide that is sprayed and therefore it gets in the air and it also gets on the clothing and goes back into the households of these farm workers. So there was a consensus among EPA scientists that the research was troubling enough that they thought that it should be removed from the commercial marketplace, that it should be deregistered is the technical term. And that recommendation was presented to the EPA administrator. And in March of 2017, Pruitt, after having had intervention by Dow Chemical, which is the main manufacturer of it, and also agricultural entities that use chlorpyrifos, Pruitt overturned the recommendation of his own scientific staff and decided to keep chlorpyrifos on the market.
What does this show you about how the administration views science, particularly at agencies like the EPA?
I think that there were several signs, particularly during Pruitt's tenure, that the agency's own science was being pushed aside for science that the industry was advocating. There was another example having to do with gliders, which is a type of a truck which they retrofit old trucks that have they have really antiquated emissions controls, and they essentially rebuild the truck around an old engine, and this allows someone that's buying the truck to avoid modern requirements for emissions controls on diesels. And over the last 20 years, diesel trucks have tremendously improved their emissions, the particulates, the sulfur, and nitrogen oxides. And so, again, in that case, the EPA's own engineers and scientists were like, what's going on here? How's it possible that the EPA could be creating a loophole to allow dirty trucks back on the highways? And chlorpyrifos is similarly an example of science that seemed to be taken under the control of the regulated parties. And a lot of staff was frustrated and surprised and disheartened. And I mean, Pruitt is now out, and it's a little unclear just the extent to which the acting administrator Wheeler is going to continue to sort of embrace industry-funded science, or whether or not he's going to sort of put confidence in his own people's work.
Right. There was a talk of doing a sort of science debate on climate change. That seems to have gone away under Wheeler.
It was actually, apparently the White House vetoed the idea. There was what they call red team, blue team, where Pruitt was determined to try to challenge the whole endangerment finding, which is the justification for the regulating carbon dioxide. And so there was some talk of having a kind of a mock debate, a public debate about whether or not, climate science and climate change are real.
Well, let's have a debate about that. Bring scientists in, red team scientists, blue team scientists.
Who are the red team scientists?
The red team scientists are the ones that don't take for granted that you see across the spectrum, that the climate is just in this unsustainable path of existential threat. And
there's no discussion of that now under Wheeler's tenure.
Another deep in the weeds subject is maybe near and dear to your heart, New Source Review. The Trump administration is trying to roll back this regulatory tool. Can you tell us what New Source Review is and how the administration is trying to change the application of it?
Sure. New Source Review is a program that the EPA has used really intensely in the last 20 years. It essentially requires older power plants as well as refineries and other factories that are going through renovations, that if you're going to go through a renovation, that you're required to modernize your emissions controls to the most advanced emission controls possible. The argument is that because the United States had improved emissions control requirements over the years, it generally grandfathered older plants because it realized that if it forced them to spend $1 billion to replace all of their emissions controls, it would essentially push them out of business. The conclusion was that they said, okay, well, if you're going to renovate, then you have to bring up the facility to the most modern standard. So that is something that the industry has hated, and they argued that it has discouraged them from making improvements in their facilities. And the Trump administration, one after another, has been finding ways to limit the power of New Source Review in ways that the industry has been pushing for more than a decade, because they have spent hundreds of billions of dollars renovating power plants and factories and refineries, and it's a very hated provision and the Trump people are very working aggressively to curtail the power of New Source Review.
I mean, what does this show you about how the current EPA administrator Andrew Wheeler wants to operate? I mean,
the efforts to curb New Source Review have continued under Wheeler. The replacement program for the Clean Power Plan includes a provision that would allow coal-burning power plants to essentially get an opt-out of New Source Review if they make changes that reduce carbon emissions. So Wheeler continues to embrace that approach, and I mean there are people, including Jeff Homestead, a former EPA official who now is in the private sector and represents a lot of these companies, who argue that New Source Review is redundant and expensive, and there are other regulations that do effectively the same thing. And so, I mean, that's an argument that acting Administrator Wheeler and Bill Wareham, who's in charge of the Air Office of the EPA, have embraced. And they're in charge, and so they're prevailing at the moment. I
mean, do they have a point that these rules are redundant and they make industry spend money without actually giving any public benefit for compliance with these regulations? How have you answered that question in your own reporting?
There's a massive improvements in air quality that results when these plants have to undergo retrofits in their emissions controls. So huge reductions in nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide. What a person like Homestead argues is that there are other rules that already are requiring those upgrades, and so that this rule is redundant. Now, he's not arguing that the improvements aren't really significant. I mean, there's been a huge reduction in nitrogen and sulfur, which has caused smog and acid rain and really terrible things. But what my reporting tells me is that the engineers and lawyers at the EPA who really do the enforcement, that are the career people that have been there for years, they really rely on New Source Review as an incredibly important and powerful tool to basically force factories and power plants that don't want to do the modernization to do them. They are really worried that if they lose this tool, that there are particularly refineries and other factories that will go about modernizations and extend their useful life without modern emissions controls. And they're quite worried about it.
A lot of these moves are being made by people who a few years ago worked for the industries that they're now regulating. You mentioned Bill Wareham. I just wanted to, you had a story about him recently. Maybe you could just tell people who he is and what role he's playing at the EPA.
And Bill Wareham, to me, is really a perfect anecdote that sort of defines one of the most typical things that has occurred in the Trump administration across the federal government writ large. And the extent to which Bill Wareham was like the leading lawyer for the coal-burning power companies in the United States and for the refineries, for the brick manufacturers, for the American Petroleum Institute, for Coke Industries. He is just in court, dozens of times suing the EPA or defending these companies against regulatory actions by the EPA. And literally, he walked out of his job as an industry lawyer, and he walks into the EPA's Office of Air and Radiation, which sets policy on air pollution, and he takes over the same agency that he'd been essentially fighting in court, for the last decade. And he then begins to implement the exact agenda that he'd been pushing on behalf of the industries for the last decade. There was a presentation that he gave just a few weeks before the Senate confirmed him to take over the Air Office of the EPA, in which he laid out the things that he wanted to do on behalf of the refinery industry. And then he literally, a few weeks later, is in that position, and it became like a punch list for him at the EPA. He has gone through that same list and executed on those things. And to me, that's extraordinary to see basically the regulated have become the regulators. And the vastness of this sort of switch and the extent to which they are then executing on their industry's agenda is really pretty startling. And it's something that I've been really focused on trying to bring visibility to, because I think that there's not much that can be done to stop it at this point, because the president has appointed these people, they're in positions of authority. But at least there should be some transparency and visibility that this stuff is happening. Are there stories that you've done where you've tried to show how some of these vast and very quick changes have impacted sort of quote unquote real people in communities around the country? We're 2 years in, and environmental impact is a pretty slow moving thing. And many of the things that they have done so far have been challenged in court, and they have a really bad record so far in terms of actually succeeding in court. Most of what they attempted to do initially was to suspend the implementation of Obama rules that had just been implemented towards the end of Obama's tenure. And again, federal courts have said that your actions were arbitrary and capricious, that you can't simply say, we are not going to enforce this rule because we don't like it. You need to actually adopt a new rule, which is something that could take 2 or 3 years to do. That said, there are some areas where we're beginning to see, initial stages of impact, and particularly with respect to enforcement. They're doing a lot less enforcement. They're initiating fewer cases. The fines that they're issuing are smaller. For example, I was in East Liverpool, Ohio last year, where I was visiting a community where it had been a 3-year delay between a notice of violation involving a hazardous waste incinerator and also across the other side of the town, a manganese warehouse that was spreading manganese dust into the air, and there were suggestions that it was causing childhood developmental disabilities as well. There had been no action by the EPA to force these companies to do the cleanups that it seemed obvious had to occur. And now, subsequently, there was one of the actions ended up getting an enforcement action. But there's been a significant slowdown and follow through on notices of violation. So that's something that is definitely affecting communities across the United States. And you've kind of documented an actual slowdown between the pace that the EPA would do this kind of enforcement under the Obama administration versus this one. Yeah, we actually compared George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump, and we looked at the start of all three of those administrations and the number of enforcement actions and the value of orders for retrofits to broken pollution controls. And there's been a significant decline, not only compared to Obama, but compared to George W. Bush as well. So you started covering the Trump administration even before the 2016 election. You did a lot of work on Scott Pruitt while he was Attorney General in Oklahoma, and close ties between him and the oil and gas industry there. What can you sort of tell us about sort of the patterns that you saw when Scott Pruitt was in Oklahoma, and was that some sort of preview for what we're now seeing in terms of EPA? Certainly. I mean, what Pruitt did at Oklahoma Attorney General and what Pruitt did when he ran the EPA was exactly the same in terms of the extent of his relationship with the oil and gas industry and his courting of the industry. And I mean, Pruitt spent most of his time as EPA administrator traveling the United States, having private meetings with industry executives in which the media was not notified of his trips, not invited to these meetings. They were extremely secretive. There was orders that they not let anyone know that these events were occurring. We met with oil industry, the coal industry, the natural gas industry, agricultural industry, chemical industry. I mean, he just literally went from executive suite to executive suite and getting input from all of these players, largely about the rules that they wanted wiped out or rolled back. And what I found when I looked at his activities when he was Attorney General in Oklahoma before he was appointed by Trump to become the EPA administrator was that he was secretly working behind the scenes with the oil and gas companies to challenge the Obama regulations. And the incredible thing is that the same regulations that he then intervened in federal court and intervened with the federal agencies on behalf of Devon Energy and Continental Resources and Chesapeake, those same regulations that he tried to block during Obama, he then went into the EPA and he rolled them back. And these oil and gas companies were making large donations to the Republican Attorney Generals Association, hundreds of thousands of dollars to help elect other attorney generals. And he was running the Republican Attorney Generals at the same time as he was taking letters that they had written and basically signed them and put them on a state stationery and sending them into the EPA and to the White House and to the Department of Interior, without any public disclosure of the fact that he was collecting money on behalf of Republican attorney generals and then intervening with their own words before federal agencies. So that was something that he was doing when he was at the Oklahoma AG, and then he came to the EPA and he continued to work extremely closely with the regulated parties and largely spent most of his time what appeared to be simply trying to pursue their agenda. And now he's gone.
But I mean, I think you'll hear from folks like Jeff Homestead, who you mentioned, former Bush EPA official. Yeah, we're representing industry because this is our political philosophy that industry has been overregulated and we won the election. So if you don't like it, tough. Do you think they have a point, or is there still sort of a problem with the transparency of, where they're getting a lot of their ideas and their support and things like that?
I mean, Andrew Wheeler, since he became the acting administrator, has had a quite different approach. He has been public about where he's traveling. He's gone to the regional offices of the EPA and met with EPA staff. He's met with, nonprofit groups and with industry groups. I mean, I just think he is acting in a more kind of traditional way. I mean, there's a pendulum swing that occurs in every, 8 years or so in Washington with party switches. And you expect, that any administration to change and that some administrations are more closely aligned with the environmental agenda, others are more closely aligned with the industry's agenda. I think that what Pruitt did was really an extreme, and the secretiveness of his kind of, working behind the scenes with the industry was startling and disturbing as a reporter who sought transparency and was denied even knowing, when the United States government and taxpayers are paying for the administrator of the EPA to travel across the United States, as a reporter that covers the EPA, we have a right to know where that person is going and to be there because he's taking a trip on behalf of the public. Unless there's some kind of a secret negotiations involving something that have some kind of a, national security, concern, then that meeting we should be able to be present for that, even if it's not that interesting or exciting. And Wheeler has largely let reporters do that. And so the thing that Pruitt did that was sort of surprising was that there were actions he took where you were left scratching your head thinking, who's the constituency? Even sometimes the industry was like, why is the EPA doing this? We don't like what they're doing with the CAFE standard, although this has happened under Wheeler. By 2025, there was supposed to be a significant increase in the efficiency of automobiles to try to reduce carbon emissions and also to improve their efficiency. The EPA is now, rolling back that efficiency improvement, which is something that the automakers had agreed to during the Obama administration. And they'd already sort of built their business plans around trying to achieve that. It's like, who's the constituency there? It was just a little confusing. And so I don't see that happening as much with Wheeler. It is certainly true that Obama really used his executive power to an extreme. He was frustrated with Congress. He decided that he was going to use the power of the pen to expand the environmental reach of the federal government. And he created a backlash. And to some extent, the middle America anger at the federal government, quote, overreach And the election of Trump emerged from this anger at the EPA and at the activism of the federal government. And now it's not to say that you can blame Obama for Trump getting elected, but Obama was a very activist user of executive power. And Trump is now rolling back that same expansion of executive power that Obama, took advantage of.
A lot of the coverage has been about climate change and clean air, but there's a lot of other stuff going on at the federal level. Can you just talk about the breadth of the changes in environmental policy?
Most of us are focused on air pollution, but what's happening is much broader than air pollution. So most of the time you talk about climate change and clean power plan, that's the thing you hear the most about. But it's much broader than that. What's happening is much broader than that. And I mean, everything from the pesticides that are on the market to the toxic chemicals that you can buy at your Home Depot that are used in dry cleaners, to water that gets let out of factories into streams and rivers, and to waste disposal, to how public lands are used for oil and gas, to how coal mines are regulated, the hundreds of millions of acres of public lands that the federal government owns and the pace of leasing, the protection of endangered species, the protection of groundwater. Almost every aspect of environmental policy in the United States is on the table and is in the midst of a transformation that is of a level of intensity that we haven't seen in the United States in decades. And so it's all in play at once. And it's almost overwhelming. I mean, and so it's hard to keep track of. And so I just think that we often are so focused on simply the air pollution when it's a much broader thing that's happening right before our eyes.
You've been on this beat like white on rice. There's a question, whenever they do these surveys about the environment, how important is the environment to you? Most people are going to say, yeah, it's important. But when it comes time to sort of elections, the environment ranks fairly low on the list of priorities behind things like economy, jobs, et cetera, education. So I guess my question is, your stories have been so impactful in terms of just sort of outlining what's happening in the federal government. Do you think that I don't know if you can answer this, but do you think that the public is engaged with this issue area, the environmental issues in the federal government?
I think that there's a greater awareness, engagement, interest in environmental issues right now than there has been for some time in the United States. I mean, it's just even with the extreme weather that's going on and a greater sensitivity to, this issue. So, I mean, is it an issue that is front and center enough that it is going to drive elections in the United States? That's still unclear, and I think the economy is still a greater force in terms of compelling people to vote. But I do just personally have a sense of a level of engagement on this topic that is greater than it has been in some time, and there's an intensity of interest. I mean, it doesn't rival the intensity of interest in like the Mueller investigation and the Trump debacles that go on. I mean, I can simply just look at the readership of stories, and the American public still has this incredible fascination with Trump and his, various crazy things that happen every other day in Washington and with the investigation of Trump. But this issue relating to regulation and the environment is out there on the charts, relatively speaking, in terms of interest levels. I can tell that just by tracking, in terms of readership levels of the stories that we do. And the paper is very committed to this topic. The New York Times is, and the amount of resources that we're spending on it, and the ability to travel is necessary around the United States, and to work on stories for weeks or months is necessary. It's something that we're very committed to, and we're doing it because we sense the readers are really interested in it.
What is it that motivates you to sort of like do these big investigations? And is there any fatigue in following this administration for you?
I just find when people manipulate the system to their own advantage, it really motivates me to out them and bring transparency and, not let the game playing going on without at least exposing the game playing. I'm really driven to bring light to the kind of the behind the scenes maneuvers by the regulated parties to get their way. That doesn't mean that the outcomes are going to change, but at least the public is aware of how this came to be. It's fascinating. It's a challenge. It's like a puzzle as to how can you, break through the veneer of that we're doing this simply because the cost of the regulation and understand who the parties are behind the scenes and, what's the real story. So it motivates me. And it's just really important. I care about the environment and the quality of the environment, and the seat that I have at the New York Times is a kind of a rare commodity that I've got to take advantage of because I have the resources behind me to spend the time and the money necessary to dig into this. And if I don't take advantage of it, how can you let that be wasted? And the platform I have when I write my stories, it gets such reach and it has such impact. It's, you can't let a day go by and not take advantage of that.
Well, thank you very much. This was great and really appreciate your reporting on this.
Thank you.
Eric Lipton is a reporter for the New York Times based in Washington, D.C. Thanks for listening to the Trump on Earth podcast. I'm Reed Frazier. Kathy Nauer is our executive producer. Andy Cubis produced this podcast. All of our past episodes can be found online at trumponearth.org. A reminder, you can support the Trump on Earth podcast by going to Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. Thanks to all who have given. We're using any money we raise there to improve our audio production. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.